Hi, it's Grandma here, and I'm reading Snow Treasure by Marie McSwigan. In the last chapter, the commandant is getting tired of having all these children sledding by, and he wants the children to be back in school. Chapter 16. Peter chuckled to himself. The commandant didn't know that Mr. Anders, the schoolmaster, had joined the Norwegian army, had gone away to fight. There would be no school, no matter what the commandant ordered. But that was reckoning without that resolute individual. There would be school if a German officer had to teach it. The grown folks had been told. When they first heard of the new order, they sent a committee to tell the commandant about Mr. Anders, and such was his reply. When Peter came back from the Holmes farm the next day, he saw German soldiers posting notices throughout the town. They had nailed long white handbills to the church door and on the post office and on the very school itself. Now they were putting additional ones on the light poles. The handbills were printed in Norwegian. They said that all must go about their lives as before the German occupation. Fishing and canning must be commenced as soon as the weather permitted. The soil must be planted as fully as in former times, and above all, the notices told, the children must return to school. Nothing more quickly demoralizes a civilian population than to have its children idle, the notice proclaimed. Peter watched the soldiers at work. Everything they did was neat and thorough. They brought their own tools, even to a short ladder. A corporal and a squad of 8 marched to a corner, saluted stiffly, and divided into groups. Thus they went about their tasks, informing the people of Rijswijk the will of the German force of occupation. One of the soldiers was the blue-eyed private Peter had noticed the first day the Germans had come to Norway. He looked wistful then, and today seemed sadder than ever. It was as if he hated sending the children back to their books. "Hello," he said shyly in Peter's own language, but of course Peter could not reply. And seeing him close, Peter thought he looked younger than the others. He would be 20 or 21 at the most, Peter fancied. To the children, the German uniform was a common enough sight, but among the grown folks it caused consternation. In truth, the Germans had stayed by themselves on the beach near their barracks and only in rare instances had come up the mountains to the town. But if their appearance caused a commotion among the townspeople of Rijswijk, they did not show it. They chose to act as if they did not know the Germans were there. The German soldiers stared frankly, but the Norwegians walked along the streets with their heads in the air. They finished their errands hurriedly and went to their homes and stayed there. Then the minute the soldiers marched out of town, they began coming out of their house again. They gathered around the notices to study the new orders. There was a little procession to the pastry shop, the konditorei. Peter saw his mother coming out of their house. He stacked his sled against the wall and ran to join her. "The notice, Mother, you've read it? It says school must open on Monday." "Yes, I know." Mrs. Lundstrom quickened her steps. Inside the konditorei, a little knot of people had already gathered. They had come not so much to order the inviting-looking sandwiches nor the delicious little ice cakes and pie crust goodies as to discuss the latest order. But there was no need to anyone to say aloud the question that was first in their thoughts. With school reopened, how are we going to get the gold to the snake? Mrs. Lundstrom felt they should be careful about discussing it and warned the others to caution. The soldiers had barely left the town. They might return. "I'll take a dozen of your raisin cookies, Frau Flack," she said, "and do be careful," she was saying when the door actually did open and in came a Nazi recruit. "That you wrap them carefully," she finished lamely. The soldier was the blue-eyed private who had said hello to Peter. He only wanted a smorgasbord. He chose one of the open egg and herring sandwiches and asked for a cup of coffee. Then he took a seat at one of the tables by the wall, his back to the women at the counter. Frau Flock brought him his order. He began to eat his smorgasbord, slowly at first and then more rapidly. With his entrance, the many busy tongues were stilled. Not a single syllable had been spoken the entire time he was there. When his own words died away, there was complete silence. As if he realized that all eyes were on his back, he ate his sandwich and tried to drink the steaming coffee, but it was too hot. After a couple of mouthfuls, he pushed aside the cup and rose and took his leave. "You see," Mrs. Lundstrom stretched out her hands, "I don't want to spoil your day's sales, Frou Flock, but I think it would be better if we talked about this in our homes." Peter picked up the box of pastries his mother had bought and followed her out the door. But she did not go home, as she had advised the others to do. She walked along the diagonal of the town square to its opposite side and beyond to the house of Dr. Aker. She lifted the brass knocker. Marta, the housekeeper, smiled and welcomed. Yes, the doctor was home. Would Frau Lundstrom and Peter come in? They entered the doctor's study. Cheerful with its chintz-covered furniture and shining hearth brasses, Dr. Aker gave them a cordial welcome. "Come sit down." His good face shone only a little less brightly than the andirons. "I'll have Marta brew you a cup of tea." Mrs. Lundstrom dropped into a deep chair the doctor drew up for her. Peter sat down beside her on a stool. "And how are you, doctor?" she asked as he fussed with the fire. "Never better, Frau Lundstrom. I think the blizzard did a lot of good to my old bones. I tell you, I feel spry." "That's just what happened to Per Garson," Mrs. Lundstrom said. "He complained constantly before the storm. Now he never mentions any pains." "Well, we old people have a way of feeling things that you young ones know nothing about. It's sort of an added sense." "Is there any sickness in town, doctor?" Mrs. Lundstrom asked. "I must say, Frau Lundstrom, Rysvik has never had a healthier winter. I think the long cold is beneficial. It seems to have killed the germs." "But I saw you going out during the blizzard. I thought someone must be very sick to get you out on such a day." "Oh, it was only to see Granny Gola. The poor soul gets pretty lonesome living by herself. She's always so glad for company, so I make it a point of seeing her twice a week. It was my day to go, and I didn't want to disappoint her." Peter's mother returned to the subject of illnesses, but the doctor disclaimed any for the town. "I tell you, Frau Lundstrom, a doctor has a hard time getting along on Rysvik. A healthier community you won't find anywhere on earth." The housekeeper brought in the tea tray, and Mrs. Lundstrom filled the role of hostess in pouring out. There was buttered toast and strawberry jam. Peter saw with pleasure. "You've been out today, doctor? You read the notice?" "Yes, I read it when I went for my walk. A good thing, too, I thought. It's best to keep people busy, especially the children." "But Dr. Aker, going back to school will stop," Peter began. "Peter!" His mother silenced him, but there was something to Dr. Aker's face that told him he understood what Peter started to say. "Oh, I'd quite forgotten about that," he said. "I'd forgotten what reopening the school will mean." "After school, is it too late, I suppose?" Mrs. Lundstrom stirred her tea. The wood cracked in the fireplace. "Wait a minute, Frau Lundstrom." The doctor set his cup precisely on the tea tray. "You were asking about the sick. Now, I'm not sure I told you the whole truth. You see, we doctors don't like to alarm the townsfolk, but in the winter one can always expect some sickness. And widespread sickness leads to an epidemic," Mrs. Lundstrom added. "And during an epidemic, one always closes the schools," Dr. Aker finished. "An epidemic. Yes, if they had to make one." "Is there really an epidemic?" "Why do you think they want word to get out that there's a lot of sickness?" "Because there's no school when there's an epidemic. And they're hoping that with no school, some of the children at least can now resume their sledding. Chapter 17. A new disease found its way into Rysvik. It attacked only the smallest children, the ones who had not yet started school. They were covered with red spots from head to foot, but the disease differed from the better-known rashes like diphtheria and scarlet fever. The patient had no high temperature. His appetite could be just as good as before the rash. Indeed, Dr. Aker did not insist that the children stop eating. He only said they must stay indoors while covered with red spots. "What is this new disease?" the people asked each other. Dr. Aker told them a name of many syllables. They could never remember it, so they called it the plague. German measles was Peter's name for it, and with reason. He had been in Dr. Aker's study when he packed his bag before going to visit Bunny, the first of his patients. Peter had seen him put a bottle of red disinfectant that he used for cuts and bruises. Cotton on the end of a toothpick made a good paintbrush. Bunny Lundstrom had as thick a coat of spots as the leopard on the Noah's Ark. Bunny was told he was to quarantine. He had no idea what that meant until his mother explained that Peter and Lovisa would go to live at Helga Thompson's house while Bunny had those spots. So quarantine meant that Peter and Lovisa had to go away from home, he decided. The 3-year-old doll twins were sick too, and Ole's 2-year-old son, little Ollie. But as soon as these had big brothers and sisters, Peter and Lovisa had the distinction of being the only ones turned out of their homes while the disease raged. School? Well, school was out of the question during an epidemic. Dr. Aker went to the commandant to explain why his order could not be carried out. Some of the children, he told, were dangerously ill. It might be fatal for the whole town, for the Germans themselves, if the disease had not checked at once. To open the school would be a sure way to spread it. On his return from the beach, Dr. Aker found Mrs. Lundstrom and Peter waiting in his office for news of his interview with the commandant and of how the doctor found himself trapped by making his plague so unusual. "How long will this disease last?" the commandant asked me. But I could not tell. "It's a new thing with us," I said, "a disease I've never treated before. It could run 9 days like measles or 30 days like scarlet fever. But we're taking every precaution. We're isolating and disinfecting." When I said it could spread to the troops on the beach, I thought he looked white. He sent for the German army doctor, a civil enough fellow named Metzger. This Metzger began asking me a long list of questions. Were the tongues coated? Was there undue perspiration? Was there a high fever? He seemed surprised with my answers and none too well satisfied. Then he nearly had me when he proposed something I hadn't thought about. "I'll take a look at one of your cases, doctor. I'll go back with you when you go," he said to me. Well, he had me there, Dr. Aker went on. It was the last thing I expected. It hadn't occurred to me that an army doctor would be called in for civilian illness, and if so, that he would insist on seeing for himself. One look by him and the epidemic would be over. Those spots might deceive an ordinary person, but they'd never fool a doctor. Yes, and that would arouse suspicion, Mrs. Lundstrom said. Maybe they don't suspect us of anything yet, but if they learn we have reason for keeping the school closed, they'll begin to ask what it is and possibly find out. Peter was open-eyed as the doctor went on with his story. Well, I had to think fast, he said. I couldn't behave as if I didn't want him, for that would surely make them inquire why he couldn't see one of the patients. So I said, "There's nothing I would like better, doctor. I'm distressed at how quickly this sickness spreads. I'd appreciate another opinion, for it seems to travel like wildfire. I'm not sure what it could spread to your whole camp here." I thought the commandant drew away from me when I started to tell of the disease. He acted as if I could give it to him by just being there. But now I saw him sort of jump. But Dr. Metzger didn't seem afraid. If it's as fast a thing as that, I would indeed like to see one of your cases, he said. The commandant, however, had a different idea. My words about how it might travel to the whole camp had struck home. He made a sign to the doctor. They went into a little room nearby. I could hear only a buzz of talk, and now and again some words I could understand. Dr. Metzger was trying to win his permission to visit Rysvik and see the new rash for himself, but the commandant was firm. Our men were up there yesterday, I heard the commandant say. You'll have all you can do to see they don't come down with the disease. He said some other things that I didn't hear, but I caught some words to the effect that they were living in a heathenish, outlandish place where a blizzard could blow up out of the calm, and that diseases were probably as freakish and unexpected as the weather. The best course for them to follow was to have as little as possible to do with the people. When they came back to me, the doctor spoke. Well, it will not be necessary for me to see any of your patients, he said. Continue with the treatment you've begun and keep a careful quarantine. Then he gave me a long list of orders about sanitation and burning waste and so on. When he finished, the commandant said, Remember, if this disease spreads to our army, you'll be accountable. Well, I could give him my word that none of his soldiers would take the disease. Mrs. Lundstrom and Peter had to laugh. Nothing but the red disinfectant and the cotton-tipped toothpicks could spread Bunny's strange disease. He waved his hand at me to tell me I was dismissed. Dr. Aker went on. I've taken the liberty of closing the school, I told him. I've also ordered all healthy children to stay indoors whenever possible. To stay outdoors whenever possible. There's nothing like fresh air to check an epidemic, I said. So the children's task could go on in spite of all that had happened to prevent it. Bunny recovered, and Lovisa and Peter were allowed to go back to their home. So it was a short-lived disease, the townsfolk decided, like 3-day measles. But there were enough new cases to keep the school closed. So the gold kept spilling down the mountain, thousands and thousands of kroners of bullion every day. 2 teams would go out one morning and 2 teams the following day. On every sled was more gold than any of the children had ever seen before. One day, Helga's team got the start on Peter's. When he reached the snake, her team was already there. She seemed buried in her own thoughts. When Peter approached, she hardly answered his wave of greeting. When he began unloading his sled, she came over beside him and dropped on her knees in the snow. Peter, she whispered, I'm frightened. I heard something. Heard something? What? Listen, she warned, still in whispers. There it is again. It's even louder here than over by my snowman. I don't hear anything. Look, something moved in the bushes. She pointed to the far side of the fjord. They ran in the direction she pointed. They pushed through the snow-hung brush, but were stopped by the black water at their feet. They were unable to cross the angry rushing stream to the far side, where the snow made a thick screen over the heavy shrubbery. If we could only get over, we could see prints in the snow. Are we being watched? Peter asked. I don't know. For the last week, I felt eyes on me every time I've turned around. Whew. That's kind of scary. Wonder who it is that's spying on them. Maybe it's an animal. Maybe it's that private that Peter seems to like so well with the big blue eyes that seems young. Maybe it's the commandant. Maybe it's one of their own members of their team, spying to make sure they're doing it correctly. Well, we'll find out in the next chapter. Bye-bye.